clearly I've done something wrong here. Let's take a look at it. It's arguments. There we go. And adding up all those numbers, it comes out to 15. Great. All right, so let's comment all that out and continue on here. All right, so functions have a built-in arguments object, which allows us to get out each of the arguments that we pass in, even if we don't define them up front. Moving on. Here's a fun little exercise. All right, so this is a slightly different take on creating the function. Now, we've given a function a name in the past, but that's not what's going on here. Here we're defining a function, but then immediately assigning it to a variable. This variable is of type object. It's a special type of object, a function object. From that point on, we can then use that function object in the rest of our application and call into it just like we would if we had given the function a name on its own. In fact, we could even do, here, let's just run it like this, and I'm going to do one more variation on it to show you how it works. All right, so 3, 1 plus 2 equals 3, right? All right, so now let's do this. Let's give this function a name of Bob. And now let's comment this out. Var my new value equals Bob 1 and 2. 1, 2. There we go. Let's see if this works. All right, this doesn't work at all. And the reason is because we have defined a function literal at the moment when we assigned our function to the variable add me. So it just ignores the other name that we give it. We can just delete it. It doesn't matter anymore. Again, the importance here is this is called a function literal, and you might think, why in the world would I even need to know that? The truth of the matter is that this is used all the time in JavaScript. Code examples you'll see online will use this often. It's very handy because you can assign a function to a variable and then pass that as, say, for example, an argument into another function or into for use in another context. So as our examples get more complex, we'll see where this kind of benefits us. All right? So let's just continue on for now and know that that is how we create a function literal. And let's talk about one last type of function called an anonymous function. All right, so let's start off and at this point our function looks exactly like what we did here. We just haven't assigned it to a variable yet. And so at this point this function is called an anonymous function. You're going to see when we work with jQuery that anonymous functions are used all the time. Now in a very simple case, a little bit difficult to demonstrate how useful it could possibly be. Trust me, used all the time. We'll get to that. Stay with us until we get into like video 15, 16 there, and you'll see this pop up all over the place. But just to show you how this might work, let's go ahead and wrap this in a pair of parentheses, and then I can call this anonymous function like so. Now by itself it won't really do anything. I guess I could just do var my result equals. So notice I'm defined my anonymous function, and then I'm going to execute that anonymous function by passing in 2 arguments here. Again, this is pretty funky stuff, right? And then we can do alert my result. But this is an important concept because we're going to see this pop up again and again in JavaScript. All right, so that worked. Now, we can just get rid of, in fact, let's just copy some of this stuff out right here. I'm going to paste it here, and I'm going to get rid of that example. And instead of creating a variable to store the value, let's just call alert with another set of parentheses around all of this, and then save it. And let's just change this from 1 to 3 just to show you that there's nothing up my sleeve here. And then execute this, and we should see the value of 4 execute in the alert box. All right, so look how compact we made that through the use of an anonymous function, executing it immediately, all in the context of an alert, a call to the alert function. All right? All right, so there is a point to this final example. Functions don't need names. They can be defined and passed around anonymously, and again, we'll see examples of this soon. All right, so several different variations on the notion of creating functions in JavaScript. Hopefully nothing here blew you away. You'll use each of these different types at various points. And as I said earlier, functions are really central to how JavaScript operates, whereas classes and objects are more central to other languages like C# and Visual Basic and so on. All right, you're doing great. Continue to push forward. We're getting closer to some really meaty stuff. See you in the next video. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to talk about JavaScript arrays. We've already seen an array in the previous lesson, and I kind of glossed over it and said, pay no attention to that for right now. Well, I think it's a good time to talk about it. If you recall this line of code where we wrote against the arguments object, and we said we can access each item in the array of arguments that are passed in. So we passed in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We used a loop statement, which is still coming soon. Hold on, we'll get there. To access each element of the arguments array or the arguments object. So the arguments array, or actually it's implemented as an object, but it works the same basic way. It's basically a variable that has compartments that hold other variables. So it's a bucket that contains other buckets that contain values inside of them, okay? And it's a convenient way of storing multiple related values together in one place. So let's start over and create some simple examples of arrays, and you can see how they work, and then hopefully that example will make a little bit more sense. So let's start off the way that we always do, creating from our template a new web page. This time we're going to call this c9js_08.html. Click save, and here we want to go 8 JavaScript arrays. Get this set up so we remember the work that we've done, and we want to set up our script tag like always. So let's start off with defining a array. We're going to call this candidates equals open and close square braces and then a semicolon. So now we've created a new variable of type array, and it's empty at this point, so we need to initialize it with some values. And the way that we do that is to use an index to access or to create an element inside of the array. They're 0 based, so we start with the number 0. And then we can access each element of the array, each bucket in the array, using its index, 0, 1, and so on. Furthermore, if we want to read a value out of the array, we access it the same way by using the name of the array and then using one of the indexes to grab an element of that array. So we want to get to the second element of the array with index 1. Let's see what we get. All right, let's take a look at our code here. And it should be candidates, not candidate. And let's try it again. There we go. All right, so that's how we define an array. That's how we access each element of the array through its indexes using square brackets all the way. All right, so let's comment out all of this, because there's an easier way to at least initialize, to declare and initialize all in one step. So let's do this. Looks the same so far, right? We'll use an open square bracket, and now we can simply, in the case of an array of strings, we can just start typing in some strings. And I could create as many as I want to here, but I'm just going to stop at 3. And so the same thing still applies if I were to use that same syntax. This time it chooses a different item in my array because I've defined them, and it keeps them in order. So this would be element 0, element 1, element 2, and so on. Okay? All right, so now I've shown you 2 arrays. Each of them are using just strings, but you can use any data type. In fact, you can even mix data types. So let's do this. I'm going to use that date object again. We're going to pass in a real date, let it parse it. So we're passing it in as a string. So here we're going to create our array. And I'm using 3 different data types. I'm using a string, a number, and then an object. It just happens to be an object of type date. We haven't talked about looping, but I think in this case, again, I just want to loop through each item easily inside of my array. And so here I'm going to spit out some HTML just using the line break. And I'll be able to easily get to each item in my array as I loop through each item in my value. We'll talk about the loop again, the for loop, a little bit later. And I've left off the S again, so let's fix that and try it again. There we go. And we're able to loop through and print out the value of each item, the string value, the numeric value, and the date value using the document.write function. Okay. Now there's a different type of an array that we can use as well, and they're called associative arrays. Let me type that out. And it allows us to do something like this. Whoops. then instead of using a numeric index, we can just use a string index or a string to index into that particular item in our array, and it's associative because now we can just associate the list with an easy to access string, like so. There we go. Sawyer's number is 15. Great. All right. So that just about does it. That's about all you need to know really about arrays in JavaScript. From simple arrays, just declaring them, using indexes to access individual elements of the array. Same here. In this example where we're retrieving the value instead of setting the value. Here we are initializing and declaring all in one line of code, using different data types in a single array and creating associative arrays where we can use a lookup value, a string, in order to get at a given element of the array. All right, very good. All right, so we're going to continue pushing forward. Our knowledge is growing little by little, but we're doing awesome. See you in the next video. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to talk about looping statements in JavaScript. I'm afraid I've kind of already spoiled the fun since we've seen several examples of looping, or sometimes called iteration statements in JavaScript. But for the sake of completeness in this lesson, we're going to talk about the while statement, the do while, the for, and the for in statements. And then we'll talk about the differences between them. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And we'll start by opening up Notepad and working with our template. All right, and here we'll want to do looping statements. Work with our script tag. Type equals text. JavaScript. Great. All right, I think we're ready to go here. All right, so let's first of all start working with an array. We learned about arrays in the previous lesson. We'll need to loop through something, so why not create a playlist of our favorite bands? So here we go, or at least my favorite bands. You can insert your own if you like, but you really should listen to these bands. They're pretty good. And feel free to skip ahead if you want to. All right, so now let's start off with just a simple while statement. And it works something like this. And it's important while you're looking at some of these different iteration statements to see the nuanced differences between each of them. They each serve a purpose. They didn't just create multiple different ways of doing the exact same thing, although the result in this particular case will look exactly the same. The fact of the matter is that there is a nuanced difference, and so you want to choose the right tool for the job, and understanding what the differences between the tools are goes a long way towards accomplishing that, right? One thing we didn't talk about with regards to arrays in the previous lesson was that you can find out how many elements are in the array by using the length property. So we use the period at the end of playlist, so dot length, similar to what we did with the strings to find out how many characters were in a literal string, right? So I think one thing is the key whenever you're working with iteration statements. Many times there's going to be an iterator. The for will work exactly the same. And so we'll need to initialize that value to 0. And then we want to make sure, in this case, that we will continue to execute this code until this expression is no longer true. Once it's false, in other words, once I is equal to or greater than playlist.length, which we would expect to be what? Well, there are 4 items in our array. So once I equals 5, then we should break out of this loop. Now, actually, that's a little bit incorrect. Since we're starting at 0 and we're incrementing at 1 at each time, and since each index is 0 based, this will actually turn out to be 4, and then we will no longer be true and will break out, but we'll still be able to access each item, each element of our playlist array by, again, using that iterator, that variable that we set up here and calling I throughout our document. So each time we loop through, we'll increment the iterator by 1, allowing us to get the next item in the array. Okay, so let's see it in action. All right, and so you can see using document.write, we're looping through and printing to screen each of the items in our playlist array. Great. Let's go ahead and comment that out. The next thing we want to look at is a do while. Or we can actually change this and remove this and just make it while some result, because that will infer that. Okay. All right, so here's the fundamental difference between while and do while. You can see that I'm setting the value of result equal to false. We'll execute this block of code and then say, go back and do it one more time as long as some result is true. Now, some result is true. Now, since some result is false, because we set it up here, it'll break out immediately. But it will allow us to execute this block at least one time. Let's see it in action. Okay, there you go. Not exciting in this particular small case, but there will be occasions where we want it to execute at least one time and only continue executing if some case is satisfied, if some expression is satisfied. Okay? Moving on, and this is probably the most complicated of any of our examples here, is the for loop, because there's just so many parts to it. But it's also one of them that's used the most frequently. Now, as I'm typing this, try to figure out what's going on here before I go to explain it. Okay, so you can see that there is quite a long expression of code here between the open and closing parentheses. And there's three parts to this. As you can see, they're separated by the two semicolons. And the way it's to be understood is to execute and continue to execute this block of code as long as this statement is true. So here we're going to initialize the value of I. We're setting it equal to 0. Then we're going to do this check. As long as this expression is true, execute this line of code, and once you've finished executing it, iterate, increment the iterator by 1. All right? And so that's what allows it to access each item in our playlist array. Let's see it in action. Again, the result will be the same as the while at the very beginning, but the way that this was accomplished was much different. We'll talk about the differences in just a minute. Finally, you saw in the previous lesson how we used the for in. So let's do that right now. All right, so what will happen is we will loop through once for every element inside of this array playlist. There's a lot that's going on under the hood, behind the scenes, that we don't have to see. The result is similar to what we've seen up here, but we don't have to worry about creating the iterator or incrementing the iterator. That's all inferred with this keyword in. So for every item I inside of the playlist, for every element I inside of the playlist, go ahead and assign the current I to that number, whether it's 0, 1, 2, 3, how many times you've looped through already, so that we can use that then in the body of our code here to access one of the elements of our array. Let's see it in action. And again, it works. Great. All right, so we have 4 different statements to choose from: while, do while, the for loop, and the for in statement. What are the differences? Well, you choose the right tool for the job, and it depends really what you want to do. Do you need to iterate through an entire array? Then you would probably want to use the for in. I think that's the easiest, most obvious syntax. Do you need to iterate through a block of code a preset number of times, or control the manner in which the iteration happens? Then you probably want to use the for loop. We can, for example, start at the playlist length, and as long as I is greater, and we can decrement it. I think something, if that doesn't work just off the top of my head, something like it would work. So we go in reverse order. Let's see if we can make that work. All right, and after a few passes, you can see I came up with the right formula to go backwards through our playlist. And so that's just a feature of the for loop